All right, welcome to another episode of Warrior versus Zombie. And as always, we have a interesting guest. And the good news is for you, I've got a guest I've already introduced to you before back in episode 20. So if you didn't hear that episode, I encourage you after hearing this to go back and hear a little bit more of Carl Flowers' story. But we're going to revisit with Carl, and you'll understand why as we get into this. But let me remind you, for those that haven't joined Warrior versus Zombie before, that success is a journey. It's not a destination. As warriors, we all have a history of ups and downs, wins and losses that are part of making us who we are up to this point, and they provide a foundation for our path forward. We all battle our inner zombie as well as those zombies in our world. In each episode, I interview warriors who are aspiring leaders from all walks of life, entrepreneurs, artists, health practitioners, business owners, historians, and any inspired leader that has a story to tell. These warriors have a cause, unique value, and a vision that goes generations into the future. And our warrior today, Carl Flowers, as you've heard before, if you heard it, his last episode is no exception. He's a true warrior. His journey of entertaining, educating audiences spanned the last 40 years. Uh, his business topics have included communications, productivity, supervision, and finance. But his real avocation and I would say passion includes being he would say amateur, although when I listen to his stories, he often knows more and has more information than my history teachers in college or high school. But he considers himself an amateur historian that is passionate about inspiring and educating American warriors about the leaders and events that led to our founding independence and just success of this country. He specializes in sharing the stories of people and consequences who really often are overlooked today beyond Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, Revere. Carl shares stories of ordinary citizens like the bookseller, a fisherman, a woodsman, a frontiersman, Quaker, merchant, Southern planter, and doctor. Really, like I said, warriors from every walk of life, but it's cool because it's part of our history. So in this episode, I invited Carl back because I said I want to explore with you and just especially into the as we go into the second segment and third segment, um, really where we are today and how it kind of contrasts or in the context of the history that we've enjoyed as a nation. So, Carl Flowers, welcome back to Warrior versus Zombie. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for inviting me back a second time. I am doing very well in this second year of COVID, and I hope we don't start talking about it as a decade. But looks like we're coming up on 2 years pretty soon. So I'm doing well. Thank you.
Well, and that's an interesting one to just throw out there as we tee up potential discussion. And by the way, this is just a discussion. So I know we've talked about some things, and you and are good friends now, and we've kind of shared perspectives as gotten into conversation. But I'm interested in hearing your reaction to things as we go forward in the next segment, and kind of how you've weathered the storm with regard to COVID. But yeah, I'm hoping that we've learned some things from our most recent history through the last year, the year that was, and the things that we've dealt with. And maybe we're not going to continue to make those mistakes as we move forward from here. And hopefully, those of us that are entrepreneurs and warriors and trying to move forward, I'm hoping in this episode, really, Carl, that we get to explore some of that and we get to think about that. And what I would hope that the warriors today take away is not only are they not the only ones walking on the journey that they're on, but many of the things and challenges that have been overcome in the past in our history to accomplish and create what we are blessed to have, which is this wonderful country. No matter how flawed it is, it's still the best country on the planet in my vision. So I'm hoping that we get a chance to explore a little bit, and you can teach me a little bit of something in the warriors that are listening here, a little bit of something about what our founding fathers and even the people that maybe are less known, that the warriors that aren't in the headlines, which is kind of like this podcast. We really are featuring warriors that maybe don't show up in the news or maybe aren't interviewed on mainstream media, but are on the journey and doing that. So how have you weathered the storm? Well, let's do this. I'm going to take a really quick break. I know that was kind of a long introduction, but I want to make sure we have enough time for our conversation. So we're going to take a real quick break for those in the audio audience and hear a little bit of Ricky Jean Wright and come back. And then I'm going to talk to you about kind of like you mentioned the COVID in the last year. And that's episode 20, that was 23 episodes ago, is almost getting on close to a year ago, where we talked first and just kind of we heard your story back then. So if somebody wants to hear how you got from where you started to then, they can hear that. But kind of like anything in the last year that you've wrestled with, and then we'll start into some of the conversation about some of the lessons, and then we'll take another break and so on. So let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Warrior versus Zombie and Carl Flowers. All right, we're back. Quick break for those on the audio or the video and audio replay here live in the Hive. But Carl, so over the last year since we talked and since we were sharing and some of the challenges we had with the Warriors here, how's your history been, or how's your story over the last year? Anything interesting?
Well, interesting, David. I've become good at my vocation is trainer. So I was traveling 2 to 3 days a week, doing 80 to 100 in-person classroom training on management, supervision, business writing, project management, time management, those type of things. So what I call mostly soft skills. When COVID shut all that down, the companies I represent, we jumped into online training. And I'm looking at this year, it looks like I'll almost get to the 80 number. It looks like last year I did about 72, I think, in person, not live trainings online. And this year going to hit 75, 76, depending on how the end of the year goes and if the government doesn't shut down. But as I've gone through this year, of course, you can't reach people, I don't think, as well online as when you're in person. So I enjoy the in-person, and it's in November now, it looks like we've got a 2-day session in Vicksburg, Mississippi, so I'll be traveling. But as I've looked at this, all the things that have happened in the last 2 years, watching how people respond and focus on my avocation, as you call it, my passion, history, we don't learn from history. In all my management classes, I always tell people, you have to allow people to make mistakes. You have to learn from your mistakes and move forward. And hopefully when you go through training, you can learn from other people's mistakes so you don't make as many mistakes. Yet what I watch us doing in the public sector, in the public eye, is we continue to double down on failure. We continue to ignore successes or failures in the past and either repeat the same poor behaviors or fail to repeat the good behaviors. Look, we dealt with, in the Revolutionary War, Washington had everybody get vaccinated for smallpox. And in fact, the British Army had plans and were attempting to infect the American Continental Army with blankets that were ridden with smallpox germs. And there's some interesting stories of letters written between John and Abigail Adams, because Abigail Adams is trying to decide whether to have her children vaccinated in Boston, and Dr. Joseph Warren, the hero of Bunker Hill and of April 19th, he was doing the vaccination. So we have had these things, yet we fail to learn from them. It's just kind of fascinating to me.
Yeah, I actually heard a zombie there. You just, I don't think you intended to communicate it, but But one of the zombies you expressed was your desire and your history of basically doing things in person. And I've heard that zombie stated in many of the conversations, especially with people like myself. I'm a full-on extrovert. I like to be in groups. I like to do things.
Sure.
But it isn't a zombie that we've had to overcome over the last year about communicating and doing as well and hopefully better over time with the virtual as well as we've done in the in person and maybe the hybrid of the same. So it's interesting to me because I hear people say, well, it's not as good as, and I say that myself. And over the last year, I'm beginning to change my self-talk as well as my external conversation with, yeah, it's not the way I was used to, and I've had to learn and do some things that I didn't have to overcome before, challenges, zombies, if you will. Um, but it's more in my head because I come in. I did a talk to a group, and everybody was in the room, and you probably have done these yourself. And I was the only one on Zoom
Yeah.
as it evolved, and that was
Right.
very hard because getting the audience feedback, getting that, and knowing if I was communicating. So it
The
is
technology, yeah, the technology helps, but I think sometimes we hide behind the technology. For instance, I even talk to people about just because it's easy to send a text message or an email, if you have the ability and if it's news, there are certain news that you don't want to share an email. It's I can hide behind it. I got to tell David something. It's not good news for him. I'll just shoot him a text. No, I'd rather get on the phone at least, and you can hear my tone of voice or look you in the eye, even though it's not quite the same on video as it is being person to person. Um, so I hope we don't, as a human race, avoid. We are social beings, and so I hope we learn to socialize and not turn the cameras off or not just do it through text. There are better ways to do it.
Yeah, and that's actually, again, a learning, a warrior observation from the last year that I think the technologies available have evolved and continue to evolve. And
Imagine Paul Revere. Paul Revere says, what do I need to ride to all those towns for? That's all night long. I'll just send them some text. I'll put it on Twitter. They'll get it.
yeah, they'll get the message. Yeah, that's kind of why.
Sometimes you got to do it. And here's a concept that I've taught for a long time. It's not a big deal unless you make it a big deal. So when you're promoting a product or a service, or when you're promoting your business, you got to make it a big deal. If you don't get excited about it, you don't get enthusiastic about it, you don't do it in a way that catches people's attention, then they don't think it's important. And sometimes just posting stuff online isn't important. You have to get in front of people, or as I call it, get in their face in a nice way. So
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful learning. And in fact, again, over our warrior journey that we've all shared, we aren't necessarily in the same boat, but we're all in the same ocean. We're all dealing with the same external challenges of varying degrees. So it's brilliant when you think about the things that we've learned and the history that we need to take forward with us that is still relevant, as well as the new things we've learned in the most recent history to say, yeah, those are good and we need to carry those forward, but how do we mold and not double down on stupid, but how do we mold the history and the things that have worked as well as realize that these things still don't work. Handling bad news on a text is kind of a stupid thing to think about doing, but people do it.
it's easy.
And but that's a thing I think, you and I are both baby boomers. And as I look at mentoring the next generation of warriors, of brothers, of people that we try to do, is we need to take what they know and then help them understand that there's some old school logic. There's some stuff here that we've learned through history that we shouldn't forget, so that they can, as we often say, stand on the shoulders of others and get higher than we got without having to learn the same things.
And the thing is, the principles, David, still work. We can't
Absolutely.
we can't analyze history or historic figures in the context of current. We have to analyze the history in context of what they were doing, how they talked, what the words meant. When you read the words in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution, sometimes those words had a different meaning. The sense of duty had a different meaning than it has today. When we start canceling history, when we start taking down, look, before 9/11 in the 90s, the Taliban was taking over Afghanistan. They were destroying historic monuments. They were literally blowing up some fabulous historical carvings in the sides of mountains because they didn't like the history.
Yeah.
I understand that, but you can't take that history in terms of this current. We're doing the same thing now. We're tearing down statues, and it's not about whether that person was a good or bad person. In the context of what he was doing, maybe it was still a man of character. He saw the picture differently. When you erase history, when you cancel history, you leave a void. And in that void, it's possible for other people to put falsehoods or to rewrite history. We don't want to rewrite history. We want to look at it and learn from it.
All right. Well, that's actually an excellent place to take another quick break, because what I want to do is exactly what you started to do. And I knew this was going to happen. I knew as soon as we started talking about the immediate history and these things, which are all in my mind, and I know in your mind with your historical perspective, that we get into. So the next segment, what we're going to do is, obviously you're very passionate. Obviously you add value, and there's a vision of transforming and continuing us on this journey of going forward. But let's come back. Let's take a real quick break. We're going to come back and we're going to hear a little more from Carl. We'll hear a little bit of Ricky Jean Wright, and It's Not the Getting There. And what I want to explore is some of the things that you just started to touch on with a little more historical context, if you will, where you can share maybe some of the learnings about what we're doing, so that when warriors listen to this, we can't just ignore it as entrepreneurs. I know people, this is a business warrior focused type of podcast, but the important thing is all these things are going around us, and the zombie mind can be activated by that and get in the way of our warrior journey if we're not careful. So I want to take a quick break, come back with Carl, and we're going to explore some of these things. We won't get into all of them. We may have to have another episode in the not too distant future to kind of explore some of the other things, or there may be other things for us to deal with. But anyway, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Warrior versus Zombie and Carl Flowers. All right, we are back. And Carl, the energy's up. I can feel it, and we're having fun already. And when we took the quick break, you kind of started into the whole thing about canceling history and some of the other things and that we're dealing with or have been dealing with in the last year. Before that as well, and it's been dealt with throughout history in our country and others. So let's start going. Tell me, I've got some, the whole cancel culture history was on my list. Things about the whole history around immigration, the whole.
Well, let's start with the cancel, just because
Okay.
my passion, David, is the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, and in 5 years now, less than 5 years, we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American independence, so 2026. And so in that time, in this 5 years coming up and after, I'm dedicating this next chapter of my life to spreading these stories, as you mentioned earlier. I call them the untold stories of American independence. You can find them on Facebook, find me on Facebook, or contact me. I'm speaking, I'm writing about them, working on a blog or a podcast like you're doing here. Take it to July 8th, July 8th and 9th, July 9th, actually, July 8th, Washington of 1776. George Washington's in New York City. They've already had Lexington, Concord, a siege of Boston. We've kicked the British out of Boston. The British now are looking for a new city. They're going to come to New York City, the largest city in the colonies, and attack it. George Washington's defending. And finally, after a year of all this, the Congress agrees upon a declaration. We'll talk about that one in a second. But on July 9th, July 8th, Washington gets it. I can just see him getting tears in his eyes, what he's been waiting for. On July 9th, he has it read to all the troops in the New York City, New Jersey, Long Island, all that whole area. And there's a celebration in New York City, and then and New York City in those days was just from let's say Soho South or Greenwich Village South. That's all the city was. But there in the village green in front of the customs house, there's this big statue of King George III. The colonists, the patriots, the Americans, there were Tories in New York also, but the Americans, patriots, tear it down. They pull the statue down, and they end up breaking it into pieces, melting it down, using it for bullets and cannonball. But George Washington that night writes in his diary, he said, "Gee, I wish we hadn't done that. That's not the respectful way. That's not how we're going to continue this." He said, "We should leave such things to the authorities." In other words, tearing down the statues doesn't help. It immediately helps the cause, but it doesn't help in the long run. By the way, today there's a statue of George Washington in London, England, oddly enough, because of his work in the French and Indian War. So my point being, again, we want to look at the people of history and look at what they did and what they said in the context of their times and why they did and said this. So you have Thomas Jefferson. And by the way, Washington was a slaveholder. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. Slavery came to this country. So we hear a lot about this 1619 project right now. Slavery, we need to understand, was a British institution. It was propagated by the British. They had plantations in the islands. They used Dutch sailors, and there were British ships who, in fact, the guy who wrote Amazing Grace was a ship captain who realized his wrongs. So the British had this system, and they were importing or using slave labor from Africa in the Caribbean colonies. There were two colonies founded on the North American continent. There was Plymouth in Massachusetts, and there was Jamestown. 1619 Project has crafted this story, this narrative, that they brought slaves to Jamestown. By the way, there's no slaves in Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims. Secondly, the slaves arrived a year or two later on some Dutch ships, and the colonists bought the slaves. But the people of America, the people of the founders, knew it was a British institution. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, there are 27 grievances, things they didn't like about the king. They were all against the king. They used him as the focal point. And these grievances included, we don't get to elect our own officials. We don't get to pass our own laws. We don't get to choose our judges. They're putting soldiers in our house. We can't trade with other countries. But there was one grievance, there's a 28th grievance that people don't talk about today because it didn't get through the First Continental Congress. And this is the grievance. Thomas Jefferson said, the king, he goes through, he has done this, he has done this, he has done this. The king has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people. He's talking about slaves, people who never offended him. And the king has determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. So he put right in the Declaration of Independence, this is one of the things we have against the king. Now, the problem was, you couldn't get the Declaration signed by Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And the colonists, the founders reconciled. They said we first have to have a country. So when you read their writings, and I could go into much more detail, when you read all their writings, they all wanted to end slavery. They just didn't know how. And they first had to establish a country. It took another 87 years to end slavery with the advent of the Civil War. But to say that we were founded or we were created as a slaveholding country, no. In fact, today there are 80 some countries around the world that still support slavery, still do not declaim slavery. The slave trade is alive and active around the world, yet we refuse to acknowledge that. We tend to blame. Look, if this was a slavery racist country, why are all these people trying to come here? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold up to logic.
Well, and that's fascinating, and for sure, anybody listening to this podcast will know there's a whole lot more you could share on that subject and background. But my takeaway from what you're saying here is we all have to recognize what you said in the beginning of this, which is we have to look at all of these things that we find either desirable or undesirable in a historical context going back to the time that it was. And unfortunately, people who want to recraft, not only cancel, but rewrite history, come in and they prey on even warriors who are ignorantly unaware of the history, and therefore those kind of malevolent intent individuals, some of which are intentional, some of which are naive or uninformed, are doing things in today's context that that are taking us down a path that we never went down, or taking us in a place where we can't learn. So let me ask you before. I don't want to dwell on that. I want to hit a couple of other things, and we will. Like I said, I'm certain now. Just with this, we'll probably need to come back for some more episodes to talk about. One that's really very much on my mind, and it's kind of a combination. You mentioned immigration, you mentioned our borders, but also the one about pullout of Afghanistan. And there is recent history going back to 9/11, and then the overlap and the things that we should be learning historically, even in history that I've participated in, but also history of our nation. What's your thoughts on all of that, the borders, from a historical perspective?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I am an immigrant stock. My grandparents came through Ellis Island in the early 1900s, 1906 and 1907, I believe. I've toured Ellis Island, and I've seen the quarantine room there, the quarantine island. There's a separate little island attached to Ellis Island, where when you got tested for diseases, if you didn't pass muster, you either got put on a ship and sent back, or you went into quarantine. So we're all pro immigration. I don't know anyone that hates immigration. We know we're an immigration country, but we confuse in the media immigration and security. We need to keep our country safe, and we do that by testing, by allowing certain people in. We have very liberal immigration policies. As we deal with countries around the world, to get back to your other question about Afghanistan, we need to realize that through history, you can go back to the first conflict between Americans and the Muslims was in the late 1790s and the early 1800s, between the administrations of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And the Barbary pirates, the Muslims in North Africa, were raiding ships. Most of the countries in Africa were paying off the pirates. They would pay tribute to the pirates, and they would leave their ships alone. John Adams wanted to pay off the pirates. Thomas Jefferson said no. In fact, in Thomas Jefferson's administration, we built 6 ships. One of them was the USS Constellation. Another one was the USS Constitution, which became Old Ironsides in the War of 1812. Those ships were built to protect American shipping in the Mediterranean against the pirates. And that's the first recorded conflict of our country in that battle. When Teddy Roosevelt's famous saying, "You need to speak softly and carry a big stick." Yes, we should negotiate. Yes, we should do everything diplomatically possible to avoid bloodshed, but you have to back up your diplomacy with force, with might. We have an armed services, military presence in our country to defend our country. And the first thing the Constitution says is the government is supposed to protect the country. So when you look at the situation in Afghanistan, and now just in the last couple of days, we hear all the generals and head of defense, Department of Defense, saying that they believed we should leave 2,500 to 3,500 people in Afghanistan. Why? Because we fight the terrorists there rather than here. So now we have no way of telling. Now, whether it's a good decision or not, I don't want to rehash it. It's done. It's a done deal. We're now going to live with the consequences, and we'll figure something else out. Point being, you not only have to talk tough to people, you have to back up your talk with power. And that to me is a key thing. A quick story of the which I one of my presentations. A gentleman named George Rogers Clark, who's called the Conqueror of the Northwest. So during the Revolution, the Northwest were the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. They weren't states. That was called the Northwest Territory. George Rogers Clark gets permission from the governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry. They were neighbors. He's supposed to raise an army of 500 people. He raises 175 guys. They go down the Ohio River. They're trying to protect the Kentucky settlements. They capture 3 British forts on the Mississippi, right across from St. Louis, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and in the town of Vincennes. They capture these forts. But George Rogers Clark was known to, what the British were doing was arming and paying the local native tribes in Ohio and in those countries to attack the American settlements. And they were buying scalps. It was the Lieutenant Governor Hamilton in Detroit was buying scalps. He was called Hamilton the Hair Buyer. And George Rogers Clark had a reputation of being a tough fighter. So when he's in Cahokia, Illinois, he crossed the river from Mississippi, from St. Louis, you can see in the Springfield, Illinois Capitol, there's a huge 20-foot mural to George Rogers Clark. And it shows him meeting with individual every week. A different Indian tribe would come and he would hold out 2 belts, an Indian belts, beaded belts. And he'd say, I have the white belt of peace or the red belt of war. You can choose either belt you want, but if you choose the red belt of war, come back tomorrow prepared to die. And all the chiefs said, no one ever talked to us like this. They all chose peace. And George Rogers Clark is known as the peacemaker of the frontier because he talked tough and he backed it up. He said himself in his diary, he said, I determined that it didn't do well to talk nice to them. You had to let them know. In effect, he said you had to talk tough. If he knew Teddy Roosevelt, he would have quoted Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, one of the things is, and already we're kind of running close to time. So there's a couple of conclusions here. One is you're definitely coming back. We're going to do another episode. The other conclusion I have is we need to work together. We need to get you a show, a regular show to focus on these various things, because I think there's so much that warriors can learn. The one thing I want to say is we tend to look at these things that are happening in the world, if you will, as entrepreneurs, and try not to be distracted by them. And we don't want to be distracted by them, but we want to understand when things are going the right way and how to protect ourselves. And when you really think about what you just said, whether it's Afghanistan and the U.S. and our position and what we're doing and walking softly and carrying a big stick. I think that's a very important lesson for all of us in our daily walk or journey, is understanding that we have to be committed to certain things. We have to, you mentioned earlier, principles, fundamentals, those, we talked about those. And I think in our history, if we've learned anything, whether we talk about a specific strategy or situation, we've learned that being kind, being loving, if you will, to make sure that people understand that we care about the well-being of the community as well as in, our business. But then by the same token, weakness is never going to be, or not being serious about your business or about the business of our nation, is never going to be respected by those who are trying to take us out. So let's do this.
David, let me give you just one final thought, just so we
Okay.
end
Well, I'm
it.
going to give you. Hey, let me do this. Now I'm going to
Okay.
let you give me one final thought, because
Perfect.
what I'm actually going to let you give me a couple. We're going to take a quick break, and I'm going to come back, and I want you. I know there's many other things we could talk about, Carl, but I want you to give the Warriors and those listening and enjoying this podcast a few things that you'd like us to take away, if we take away anything from this discussion that you and I have had today. And then I want to also make sure that they know how to stay in touch with you. I kind of know that, but I want the audience to know that as well. So let's take another quick break.
Excellent.
We will be right back with Carl Flowers and this energizing discussion on Warrior versus Zombie. All right, we are back. And Carl, I knew this was going to happen. I mean, I knew that I was going to get to the end and go, man, there's so much more. But sometimes they say the best meeting or the best interaction is when the audience always wants to, they feel like they're left wanting for more. So when we ended the last segment, you were going to give me one last thought, but I'd like to invite you to give the audience any last thoughts about takeaways that you'd like us to get from this conversation you and I have
Sure.
had so far.
Yeah, I want to leave it on a positive note. I don't want to sound like some kind of radical neocon or anything. And you mentioned talking kindly and working. Look, the United States of America in 245 years of our history has been the most generous, most giving, the most freedom-loving country, and we have helped countries all over the world in World War I and World War II, even back to the Spanish-American War, to free people and to give them new life. We have not been a colonial power. We never kept possessions for ourselves. We, as Colin Powell said, we just asked for land to bury our dead. So we are the most generous country, both as corporately through our aid programs and individually. People you and I know, and millions of people in America, give generously to foreign charities all the time. We have a great system that was established 245 years ago, and it still works. The founders knew they would have to make some adjustments, so they set up a process of creating amendments. And in the 245 years, if you take out the first 10 amendments, which were the Bill of Rights, there were 27 amendments totally. First 10 were kind of with the Constitution. They did those right away. Of the 17 other amendments, only 2 of them were about alcohol. So it was passed, it was repealed, and it was brought back again, whatever. So there's only really 15 times we've amended the Constitution for very important things, for giving more people the right to vote, both minorities, both women. We have freed slavery. We had Civil Rights Act. We continue to make things better. We continue to improve, and because it's a system that works. So we need to keep focusing on it. Now, what can we do? First of all, if you're a praying person, John Hancock said, "I would that you pray and that you also act." And we have, as Edmund Burke said, the British philosopher, Edmund Burke said, we have bad people in government because good people do nothing. And it is somewhat shocking that in a freedom loving country, we get only about half the people out to vote. We need to be voting. Voting for people of conscience, people of character, voting for people who support the Constitution as it is, because it still works. And we need to get involved. And the way you get involved is local government. Attend school board meetings, attend your local Frisco, McKinney, Little Elm, or wherever you live. Attend your town councils, learn about local government, and be active in those things. And we'll have another 250 years for later generations, our children and our grandchildren, to enjoy the freedoms and liberties that occurred no place else in the world but here. We were the first to create this system, and it's still working. So I want to keep it there.
Well, I love that, Carl, and I love that perspective and those takeaways. And let me try, take that right into a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs. I talk about small business owners. There's so many things happening on a corporate, as you call it, or a business or a country level, and we're so inundated. If you make the mistake of being a consumer of mainstream media or any kind of media on a consistent basis that is like trying to keep you stressed and distracted in whatever form. But the fundamental that you're talking about is that this country has been and will continue to be built on small business, local level, making
Absolutely.
sure that we are
Yeah.
exercising our rights. These aren't the rights of a party. These aren't the rights of an institution, although there are institutions like the church that has rights that have been granted in our Constitution. But
Subject for another time.
it does go back to the individual, right? And I think the importance that you just emphasized there, as entrepreneurs, as warriors, is we need to carve out a part of our ideal day. It's a journey, and we should be learning and improving every day individually, in our businesses, and in our country. And that's what the country and fundamentally is built on. And we need to be part of that by being part of what we can control. There's a lot of things we can't control, and if we focus on those, then it's a distraction. But there are things we can
We can
be
be involved.
informed.
Yes,
We can
very
be
much.
part of our community. And that's a passion for me, is building community and being part of the community and adding value to the community and having an impact. So
Very much
that's
so.
beautiful, Carl. I appreciate that. Tell the audience how we can stay in touch with Carl Flowers.
Best way is my email is Carl with a C, Carl Speaks Truth at Gmail. Carl Speaks Truth at Gmail. I know that's a rather ostentatious statement, but I want to be held accountable to that. I do have a page. I have a Carl Speaks Truth page on Facebook, and also an Untold Stories of American Independence on Facebook. And also, I had started a YouTube channel, and then COVID kind of messed us up a little bit. So, but there are some of my stories already posted, and it again is the Untold Stories of American Independence on YouTube. So, and there'll be more coming. Working on a book, working on the podcast. So
That's awesome. There's a lot of different ways. And for those that are viewing this in the Be Connected community, Carl is in the Be Connected community, is just getting started. I'll be working with Carl. We'll be building and trying to figure out how to get some of his content and this show out there to the community. So you can also reach out to him on Be Connected. If you're watching this podcast or this video on other platforms or listening to it on other platforms, encourage you to go to beeconnected.com. That's BEEKONNECTED.com. And you can use My Vision Warrior as a referral, or Carl Flowers, I believe, as a referral, and be connected to any of us. And that's actually a new platform that will allow all of these kinds of conversations and all of this focus from a business standpoint. So with that, let's hear the final segment of Ricky Jean Wright, It's Not the Getting There, and we'll be back again next Thursday with another episode at 11 a.m. Central Time of Warrior versus Zombie.